So 7 years ago, I started working at a new company. And before that, I was a full stack developer. We rolled our own CMS, as one did back then. And this was the first time that I could actually work backend only. So I made an API, frontend was using that API, and I could do the things that I wanted to do. You know, make things work, not necessarily make them pretty. Because I wanted to make things work and work properly and make sure that everything stayed working, I looked into testing those API endpoints. We tried to use it a little bit with PHP unit, but it was a lot of hassle to get everything right and everything working. And then at some point we learned that some parts of our system and infrastructure wasn't being handled properly. So the configuration was skipped. And eventually I ended up with Behat. And we have been using it for the past 7 years now. And I would like to share with you how we use Behat to make sure that our endpoints work the way they are supposed to work. So first of all, what is Behat? Behat is a behavior testing tool. It is written in PHP for use in projects that are written in PHP. For the tests themselves, you use Gherkin. The executed test code is written in PHP, and it supports extensions. Documentation is available on the Behat website itself. Gherkin is the language you write your own tests in. It's a natural language. It has a given, when, then structure for the setup, the execution, and the checks. It is mostly in plain English. It's understandable without having to have the actual knowledge of the implementation behind it or the language that's being used. And it's structured in features that have scenarios that have steps. The given part is actually the setup of the state, what you would expect with PHP unit in the setup part. So, for example, you set up a user in the database and you make sure that you're logged in. The when of Gherkin is the test itself. In our case, a call to a specific endpoint. And the then is the actual check to see if everything went okay. We use that to check the response status codes, we check the response type, and we check the database again to see if stuff is actually executed. So as an example, this is a feature for deleting tasks, because my demo is a task tool. We start with a scenario that as a user you can I can delete my task. I set up the database, I make sure that as a user, that there's a task, and that I am logged in. I call the delete endpoint, and then I check that the status code is correct and that the task is actually deleted. Behat uses context to make sure that the lines of text that you write are actually executed in your test. A context file is a PHP class that provides the executable code for your test, and it matches the functions with the Gherkin steps using a regex or even simpler matching. And if you use Symfony, you can auto-wire these things, which is quite handy. We use Behat, which is an extension, a collection of commonly used contexts, to use a browser to do the REST calls and to have some JSON checks. So we don't even have to write those ourselves. If you want to match one of those lines to your executable code, you do it with a attribute, and you have a sort of placeholder in there. That placeholder corresponds with your parameters, and you can use it to actually make sure that stuff is going well. If you have something that's a little bit more complex, you can use regex, and in that case, the groups that you specify are your parameters again. So the testing itself. Let's start with a bit of happy trail testing. I have my setup for my task. I make sure that there is a user. I make sure that there's a task that is owned by me, so it's actually visible. I make sure I'm logged in. And I send a GET request. Then the response status code should be 200. The response should be in JSON. This is the most simple version of your happy trail. Having these kind of tests actually makes sure that you don't break something. You can do the same with put and post requests. If you want to have a body in it, you can do it in this way. And it will execute that. So we tested the happy trail. That was my talk. We can go now. No. What we noticed is that if we are not careful, especially when using stuff like Symfony, API platform, it is very easy to break things in a way that you don't necessarily see at first. So one of the things is missing output. I forget that I renamed a variable. I forget to add a serialization group. It can happen. It happens to me a lot. So we need to test that. We start with the happy trail again. And we add a JSON schema validation check. And inside that schema file, we make sure that the properties are there and the correct type. But we also make sure that everything that we test for is required. This way, we're sure that we're not forgetting anything. Because by default, the JSON schema checks will not complain if anything is missing. Besides missing output, we can also have too much output. So if we have an accidental exposure of fields that aren't supposed to be there. If you call upon a user, you don't want the hashed password to be returned to the front end. We start again with the same happy trail as we had before. And what we add to the JSON schema file is the additional properties false. That means that if there are any properties that are not declared inside this file, Behat will complain. So that's mostly the output. Of course, there's also input that we need to check for. So we have input fields, parts of your JSON body, that are not handled. We have a happy trail again with a title. And now we go through that thing. We make it a new title, we make it something else than it used to be before. And then we check that in the response, the title is set as a new title. But that's not all, because you also need to check if you don't forget the persist at the end. So we need to check the database itself to see if the task is actually updated. The same way, we have too much input. Say, for example, you have a task and a task has an owner. You don't want to have that ownership of a task be overwritten by someone else. I mean, yeah, you can push your tasks to another coworker, which is nice, but maybe it's not necessarily your domain. So we start with a happy trail. We add an extra user. We make sure that the user has an ID that we know. We add that user to the response, or to the request. But then we check that the test still is connected to the original user and not the new one. Next up, everyone's favorite, the security checks. A lot of systems that we make are only accessible for people that are logged in, and they are only allowed to see very specific data sets. And these kind of checks are the things that you usually see in the news when you know hear there's a data leak. People see things from other people. It's always a problem, and it's very hard to explain afterwards if that happens. So what we do is we start again with a happy trail. We remove the logged in user, check if the response code is okay. In our case, it's a 401. And then we run the test. So in this case, you're not logged in, you get a 401. The same stuff you use when you want to check if other people cannot use it. So you start with your happy trail, you add another user, you make sure that the task that you're checking is owned by that other user. And then in our case, it's a 404, it could be a 403, but I think 404 is a little bit safer. You shouldn't be able to see that task. And of course, the same goes with updating, deleting, and that kind of stuff. What we also do, we work for customers in our agency, so if budget-wise allows, we check validation tests. So we have an input, and instead of running the scenario, we generate a scenario outline. We make sure that we check for the right status, and we add a placeholder. This placeholder allows us to run this scenario multiple times with different keys and values. And you assign those as examples in the same test. This way, this test will be run multiple times for each example that you have. So the scenario outline is a template, and it has placeholder for variables, and each variable will be one execution. Besides that, we also usually want to test our business logic. So if you have a delete request and you want to check that, you need to make sure that that delete request is actually doing something. So the task should not exist anymore. Or in case you have a soft delete, you check for that. Besides this, we have in Behat the tags. And tags are a special bit of text that you can put in front of a scenario or a feature. So in this case, this tag is only for this scenario, but this tag is for all the scenarios within that same feature. If you want, you can use these to filter out requests. So if you test for a endpoint that uses a third-party connection, and your CI doesn't have access to that third party, you might want to skip those in CI, but you do want to have them locally so you can actually run stuff. You can also do this by default and just set this up like this. Behat also supports hooks, which are functions that are executed before or after each suite and the entire test, each feature, so the test file, each scenario, or even each step. Using the latter, be careful because that's executed a lot. If you use those hooks, you add a function to one of your contexts. You add a before or after scenario, feature, suite. And then you have your code that's executed. There's a scope that you can add as an optional parameter. And instead that you can access other contexts. This is the way you wire one context to another if you have dependencies. We like to do this because we have a context for each entity. And if a task needs to be connected to a user, we use the user context to generate that user instead of doing that kind of stuff inside the task context. You can also combine hooks and tags by adding the tag to the hook. And then it's only executed when a scenario is run with that tag. We used to use this if we have certain scenarios that needs to have a reset of the database and certain scenarios that didn't, but nowadays we always reset the database between scenarios. What we also use are backgrounds. A background is a sort of scenario within your feature file, but it's run before each scenario within that feature. But it's executed after the before scenario hooks are fired. You can use this if you have the same setup in multiple scenarios. So for example, I have a feature where I need a user and a task that's owned by that user. I can give it a background, and then I don't have to write that out in each and every scenario within that same feature. So that was pretty fast, the way of using Behat. So why do we use Behat this way? Why don't we write PHP files with the whole testing thing inside? Why don't we use PHP unit with a browser or direct connection to the kernel? Feature files are actually readable by people that don't know PHP. You always have the correct database state, because one of the issues that we ran into in the beginning was manual testing, PostMan, try to set up your database every single time, try to reset your database every single time. It takes a lot of time. You can test through your entire application, including all of the configuration. So you don't just test whatever goes into your handler, but you test the entire thing, including API platform configuration, serialization configuration, and everything. And you check both the API response, so whatever is returned, and the actual database state afterwards. And it has a very good integration with PHP Storm. There's a plugin for Behat that allows you to autocomplete steps. It allows you to generate steps, or generate the context functions for it. And you can click through, which is also really handy. And for me, it gives me confidence in my work and deployment. This way, it just feels nice to have everything green whenever you're working. So in conclusion, you need to make sure that it's a tool. You don't need to use it. If you want to use it, please go for it, but it's a tool like any other. Use it as a tool. It doesn't replace unit testing. Unit testing is still important to do for small units, for calculations, for that kind of stuff. If you want to use this, talk to your team. Make sure that everyone's on board. Don't just add it and then expect everyone to run it. And see if you can include QA if you have it, or your front-end developers. What we do is we have the feature files. We send the feature files to our front-end developers so they can see and read what to expect when they call our endpoints. And think about what you want to test. So make sure that you test the most important things, the things that are problematic if they break, and maybe not test everything thorough. I think I talked a little bit too fast, because are there any questions so far?
Have you run into situations where it was really hard to write a Behat test?
Yeah. We had some situations where we had a very specific endpoint where we had file uploads. And generating a actual file upload was kind of hard. Other situations have a workaround or are generally usable. We even have a context to run commands, so we can test if commands are still working. But that's, yeah, it's tricky. If you want to check if emails are being sent, you have to also provide for that. The emails go somewhere, you have to check that. Via forget system, you don't know if it's actually sent. And what was another thing? If you use a messaging system, or like RabbitMQ or Symfony Messenger, because of it being asynchronous, you cannot always check if that is being run. So we had issues where we used a message queue, and we could test if the endpoint was working. We could test if the result was good, but we couldn't test if the actual message was being run and deployed and handled. If you want to test that, you have to use other stuff, for example, PHP unit.
What is going on next door? Sorry, any questions?
My question is a direct question. How do you mock test, mock some calls, external calls, for example, or mock a service in Behat? Because I saw that you have like the pattern when, then, etc. But I didn't like, for example, when I have to mock when using like PHP unit, you have like also what arguments goes to this mock, etc. If you can explain.
So the way we use Behat is we make an actual network call to a local server. That way, we cannot really mock things because Behat runs in a different runtime than the actual handler of your request. We have one project where we needed to mock an external service, and we ended up making a actual mock server that also handles requests and does that statically. So we put some input in there, we know which output is being returned. No.
Any more questions? No.
Do you have a guideline for the developers for how to use the language in the tests?
Not really. It's very much up to your own standards. But what we like to use is we use things like is in given and should be or should not be in then. One of the drawbacks of Behat at the moment is that Behat doesn't distinguish between the given, when, and then when trying to match the lines in your feature file to the actual functions. So if you have the same the same line of text for both the given and the then, so given there is a task and then there is a task, Behat will just call the same function twice, and then you get that you actually add stuff to the database when you're trying to check stuff in the database. So if you use a little bit of internal guidelines for that, that would be handy, just to get rid of the confusion.
Thank you.
Why do you use Behat and application as a separate instances? Why don't you run Behat against application just through HTTP kernel directly to speed it up? That would allow you to replace database with in-memory database and then create fakes for services.
It's a very good question. We tried to do that, and we ran into issues where the doctrine caching would actually be in our way of checking if things were properly persisted. So because you now have a separate runtime, you also have a separate database connection. And the checks in your Behat tests will check an actual new data connection instead of you reusing the one that has been persisted. So you're never in the same unit of work.
But why do you need about database? Why do you care about database?
Because I want to know that that also works.
Okay, but your database can be replaced by something else, right?
True.
Like a fake service, which basically it's an in-memory repository, and then can give you an instant access without having to deal with unit of work or whatever magic happens behind the...
Yeah, that's true. What I also like about this setup is that I can run one test specifically. So you run Behat with the line of the parameter of the feature file, and you can even do a colon and then a line number. You run one specific file of one specific feature while I work on my code. And in that case, it's very handy to have the database actually, or the changes actually in your database, so you can see that stuff is working or not working, or you can figure out why it's not working. So I don't only use it as a testing tool, I also use it as my development tool, because I don't want to bother with running PostMan over and over and over again, and then ending up with either too many or too little things. If I'm implementing a specific delete endpoint, and I have to re-add an item to the database, test if the things are working, it doesn't work, it gives some kind of a 500 error. I have to go back, re-add the thing in the database, trying again, do more stuff, trying again. And this way, I actually have a working thing like it would be in production.
Sorry, I would just replace database connection with some kind of um, integration tests. So your repository method to delete a record from the database is run only once, but then your all Behat suite can run much faster because it does not rely on the database. And like deleting records from the database, it takes time, but making a new instance of in-memory repository, it takes
it's free. You can speed it up. So if you want to do that, it's fine, but you'll probably have to make your own wiring. Behat gives you the tools to actually work with an HTTP client. So that's what we thought was handy. But you said, it's interesting, you said something about time, because I actually ran my tests right before this talk. And it takes about 5.5 minutes for almost 15,000 steps and over 1,000 scenarios, which to me is still pretty fast. And this is with an actual database.
It's pretty fast, I agree, but it's 5 minutes.
It could be fast, that's true.
It's 5 minutes.
Yeah. So if you have a really big suite and you run into issues, then that might be a good idea to speed things up.
I mean, I work with Behat a lot, so in general, I try to avoid talking directly to the database and replacing any external services with fakes or like replacement services using the hexagonal architecture approach.
Yeah, if your application supports that, that's really handy and nice. Again, I work for an agency. We have clients with small budgets, so it's all.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, just flat work. Good point.
It's not a question because I just want to point out that if you use Symfony container, not the whole framework, but only the container to do the dependency injection, there's an extension also to answer to the guy that asked before. So there's an extension under the friends of Behat, if I don't recall.
The Symfony extension.
That make you let you substitute your dependency before the test runs. So yeah, you can actually switch the version and use also the mocks or whatever you want.
Yeah, we tried that when we started this, so 6-7 years ago, and we noticed that some configuration things weren't really handled properly when we use this, and you have to be very careful with memory leaks.
Oh, okay, no, because we also use Behat and also the extension, and we have really a lot of tests, and we never have a problem. So yeah,
nice.
Can I make a question? Yep. So how do you handle the fixtures? I mean, the data fixtures for the test. You use a preset of static created fixture, or you do something like more dynamic ones?
A very good question. We used fixtures in the beginning, but then we noticed that whenever we added another test that had a very specific thing that wasn't covered in the fixtures, we updated the fixtures, and then all of our other tests failed because all of a sudden we had 3 things that came back in the response instead of 2. So we don't use that anymore. We actually contain everything that we need to set up the test in the given part, and mostly the background.
Yep, and I saw that you have an hook for resetting the database.
Yeah.
So I can guess that you don't run things in transaction because it could be a faster way to handle things. So you start the transaction at the start of the scenario. You do the write, the read, the delete, whatever on the database, and then you roll back everything. And so you don't have to.
Yeah, because we use the actual browser to call upon the endpoint.
Yep.
The transaction isn't
Okay.
transferred to that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
So we can do that.
Yeah. I see.
So the text that you use in like the given, when, and then statements, obviously it's got to be pretty specific. Is that like, how do you know what the format of each thing has to look like without going to look in the code? You know, if you've got someone who's trying to write the test case.
You don't really.
So you just have to know that it has to say there is a user with an email address. Okay.
Yeah, so the matching is done on that part. So you look at your the context that you write, and then you know what you can use. And if you use open source context, you have to also look into those. The plugin for PHP Storm helps a lot with this, because you just type JSON and then try to autocomplete it, and it will give you a list of all the available options.
Just a curiosity, how do you debug the code if you got an error during the execution of the test? Because as far as I understand, it's not directly connected to the kernel, so you can't use xdebug, for example, to step the bug from your test into the code.
Yeah, what we use is the Symfony profiler, because it's an actual call. The profiler will work, and it'll make a generated token for that. And the Symfony extension will actually print the profiler link of each scenario in the output, which is also really handy.
There's a question on the YouTube video. Is it thinkable to have the PO writing acceptance test directly in Gherkin?
Yeah, but I wouldn't do that on this level of testing. So what we went for is an actual end-to-end test for backend only, which means that your PO has to have knowledge about which endpoints to use for what. If you want to incorporate a more PO-friendly version of testing, you need to test everything, so your entire application, front end plus back end. And then you can write your Gherkin tests as an actual user story, more or less. But if you do that, then you don't necessarily need Behat. You can just use other testing tools that use Gherkin as a language.
And there is another one, or maybe it's continuation. It says, also, I suppose for frameworks like Symfony or Laravel, you can tell Behat the env to use. For example, by default, PHP unit looks for testing environment. Mm-hmm. That's a yes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, if the only drawback is that if you use an actual server like we do, that doesn't transfer naturally. So you have to make sure that that server also is in test mode instead of dev mode if you want to use specific services.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much, Timo. And please, you know, I'm competitive about applause, so come on.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are a bit early, so yeah, please take pictures.
Yeah. I have a demo project set up if you're interested, and yeah, it's a very simple to-do app.